a little bit behind. We're on Chav Zayin Amud Bet, and we pick up at the very top of Chav Zayin Amud Bet with the position of Rabbi Eliezer, who says that you have to have 14 meals in a sukkah, 2 each day, all 7 days, and also says, relatedly, that you don't fulfill your obligation with a sukkah built on Chol HaMoed in the middle of Sukkot, or if you go to a friend's sukkah, it has to all be your one sukkah all 7 days, and that's what establishes it as like a substitute house. So very demanding position of Rabbi Eliezer. But the one concession, and we'll pick up from there, 4 lines from the top of Chav Zayin days, he will concede that if your sukkah fell down, you can rebuild it on Chol HaMoed, and it's considered to be a continuation of the first sukkah. So now the Gemara says, my time is Rabbi Eliezer. What's the reason of Rabbi Eliezer? That he demands it only be your sukkah that you're in for all 7 days. Amar Kra, the verse says, you should make it for you. I say sukkah haru'iyah l'shiva. Oh, excuse me, we're going to get to the l'cha in a minute. It should be shivat yamim. It needs to be a 7-day sukkah, which for him means to be, well, that's focusing on the idea that it can't be a sukkah built on Chol HaMoed. It can't be a sukkah that was only around for part of the Chag. For Rabbanan and the rabbis, Hachi Kama Rachmana. This is what the Torah is saying. I'll say sukkah bichag or lichag. Make a sukkah for the yantiv, but it doesn't mean that it has to be a 7-day sukkah. But he does concede that you can rebuild it on Chol HaMoed. So the Gemara says, Pshita, it's obvious. I know it's not so obvious, and the Gemara will tell you what the Chiddush is. No, I might have thought that the new one you built, this halacha, is considered to be a separate sukkah, and it's not a 7-day sukkah. Kamash Malan, we don't say that. So this is Rabbi Eliezer's position. The sukkah has to be for all built and standing for all 7 days, but obviously he goes further and he says you have to live in the same sukkah for all 7 days. Tanya, and that's what we're going to turn to now. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, the same way a person does not fulfill his obligation with his friend's lulav on the first day. So lachem means you should take for you misha lachem. It has to be yours. You don't fulfill your obligation by going to your friend's sukkah. You just make for you mishalcha. It has to be yours. And again, all these positions seem linked. It seems like his idea is that to some degree is to establish this as your substitute house. It has to be around for all 7 days, and you have to be living in it for all 7 days. So even if one meal you had elsewhere, you would not be considered a full substitute for your house. Of course, the question is, as Tosfos asks, that does this really mean that that you have to have that every person in the house has to own a separate sukkah or not? I think let me just try to find the Tosfos where he mentions that. Hold on, where's the Tosfos? Hold on. A minute. He says like this. Yeah, so Tosfos says near the bottom on Kol HaEzrach B'Yisrael, he says, V'teima, says Tosfos, Rabbi Eliezer devised Sukkah Shalachem, Ein Shnaim Yotzim B'Sukkah Echad, La'olam, because this is Tosfos also going to get to a point we're going to see in a minute that you can't even own it in partnership. It has to be all private and individual ownership. So he says, V'yitzarech l'chol b'nei habayis, Sukkah l'kol echad v'echad. Every member of the household needs his own sukkah. Okay, it says maybe v'shema have marbi midachsiv teishu kein taduru shecholim leishev yachad b'sukkah achas. Maybe for a household, because that's an idea of teishu kein taduru. That degree of partnership is allowed. A partner with your neighbor, that's not good.
See, partnership sukkahs, that's good.
But maybe, right, there you go, very funny. But
so much for these sukkah hops.
I know. Anyway, well, you can sukkah up as long as your main meals are in your sukkah.
Everybody would be eating alone if they each needed their own sukkah.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, but that's why he says, well, that's the point. You wouldn't be able to have guests over. You could have guests over.
Yes, I'm saying
In your house, you're members of your household, right? So Tosfos says obviously your members of your household have to be. We have to assume that even according to Rabbi Eliezer, that would be considered your private sukkah. But beyond that, you cannot go. You need all 7 days, all 14 meals. You need 14 meals. They all have to be in your one sukkah or your house's, your household's Sukkah. Okay, that's Rabbi Eliezer's position, and again, presumably this idea of really establishing it as your substitute house. The Chamimomim and the sages say, although you don't fulfill your obligation on the first day of Sukkot with your friend's lulav, you can go ahead and fulfill it with somebody else's sukkah. All of the citizens of Israel will dwell in Sukkot. So what does that mean? So they read it, all the citizens can dwell in one sukkah, although it says sukkahs in the plural. So how can you have them all in one sukkah? It must be that they're taking turns, and it must be you don't all need to own the same sukkah. Of course, Rashi says, what do you mean? Maybe they all own it in partnership. So this is Tosfos's point, that you see that according to Rabbi Eliezer, if he's demanding ownership, he would reject even the idea of partnership. That Rabbi Eliezer demands really, again, let's bracket the case of your own family, but outside of family, he'd really demand private ownership. And the rabbis say, no, obviously you see in the verse that it's not possible to have, that everybody can live in one sukkah. So we're not talking about private ownership, we're talking about partnership. And once you're talking about partnership, if that's okay, it's also okay to borrow somebody's sukkah, and it doesn't all have to be a sense of yours. Okay, that's what the Chachamim say back. Okay, so the Gemara says like this. If the rabbis say you don't have to own your sukkah to be yotzei, what do they do with the verse lecha, yours? To exclude a stolen sukkah. But if it was a borrowed sukkah, repeating what we just said a minute ago, ksiv kol ha'ezrach, that we know is okay. All people can live in one sukkah, meaning again, and if that allows either partnership or taking turns, you do not need private ownership. So the only thing being excluded is stolen. Rabbi Eliezer, Hai Kol Ezrach Ma'avidle. What does Rabbi Eliezer do with the verse? All citizens in one sukkah, since he basically says he says you can't share a sukkah; it has to be your private sukkah. So what does he do with it? So that's to tell you a chiddush. All people, meaning even if you just became Jewish in the middle of Sukkot, or you became a legal Jew in the middle of Sukkot. What does that mean? You had your bar mitzvah, if you're a boy, on Chol HaMoed, or somebody converted on Chol HaMoed. So since Rabbi Eliezer says normally you need all 7 days in a Sukkah, maybe this person would be exempt because they can't have all 7 days in a Sukkah because they only became Jewish or an adult in the middle. So no, Kol Hezrach is telling me for these people that there wasn't another option. They can be Yotzei even with a Sukkah only for half of the Chag.
I've never heard of someone converting on Chol HaMoed.
What can I tell you? It's a hypothetical. Okay? Right, people share the Sukkah in Europe?
Yeah, but one sukkah for the whole...
Really, for the whole community?
Not for the whole community, but
like for
people who live in the building.
Very interesting. Yeah, I mean, you have it now, for now that you have people in buildings, right? So they build one sukkah for everybody in the apartment building, or the shul sukkah. Okay, yeah, Rabbi Eliezer would give you a real hard time if you lived in an apartment building. I know what you would do. Okay, he says, okay. The Rabbanan, the rabbis would say back, even the rabbis say, look, anyway they hold you can have a sukkah not for all 7 days. So lo itztrichkra, they don't need a case for that special, interesting case where somebody only becomes obligated in the middle. Okay, so that's the debate again with Rabbi Eliezer really insisting it has to be fully your substitute house. Tana Rabbanan, Rabbi Tom. Ma'aseh Rabbi Eloi, Shalach Lachbil Pnei Rabbi Eliezer Rabbo, Lod. So Rabbi Eloi went to greet Rabbi Eliezer, his Rebbe, in Lod. Lod was where Rabbi Eliezer lived. Bereg, and on the Yantiv, on Sukkot, presumably Sukkot, or not necessarily Sukkot, a regel, we'll see, a regel. Amarlo, he said to him, Eloi, Ein Chamishov Seha Regel. You are not of those people that stay home during Yantiv. Now, because look, first of all, if it was Sukkot, he'd have a problem with him because he felt that everybody had to stay home and live in their own sukkah. So you can't, if you're at Sukkot, you're in somebody else's sukkah, you're not Yotzei, right? So he would have had a big enough problem there, he's not Yotzei sukkah. But this presumably isn't even Sukkot. And even though it's not Sukkot, forget being Yotzei sukkah by staying home and using the same sukkah for 7 days. He still didn't like the fact that he traveled to visit him. Why? Shai Rabbi Eliezer Omer, because Rabbi Eliezer used to say, I praise the lazy people that don't leave their houses on the regel. Now, he doesn't really like the fact that they're lazy, but it's sort of like the principle that even a stopped clock is right twice a day. So even if you're lazy and it's not a good reason, but if it leads to the fact that you're staying home during the Yontiv, that's good. You should be staying home during the Yontiv, whatever your reason is. V'samachta atau beitecha, or v'samachta b'chagecha sameach. But anyway, you should rejoice, you and your household, meaning that you're obligated, speaking to men, to have simchas haregel and to celebrate the regel together with your wives. This was a big thing. In the time of the Hasidim, the people would leave their families and travel for the regel. Right now, people are going where they go for Rosh Hashanah. What? Uman and this and that. So it's not a new thing that men abandon their homes and go and do these pilgrimages on the regel. So he said, you know what? The mitzvah on the regel starts with experiencing it with your family. Okay, so you should have stayed home. Even if it wasn't Sukkot. Forget Sukkot, you need to stay home because according to Rabbi Linzer, to be Yotzei the mitzvah Sukkah. But even on another regel, you should be staying home and spending it with your wife. Aini, is this really true? How do you know you have to greet your Rebbe on the regel? Why are you going to greet him today? This was said by the woman whose son died, right? And then she was going to Elisha, and Elisha was going to resurrect him. So her husband said to him, she didn't know he was going to resurrect him, but that's what happened. Anyway, so the husband said to him, why are you, this is Isha Shunamit, why are you going to him today? It's not Rosh Chodesh, it's not a Shabbat. It's not a special day to visit, to visit a holy man. So Michlal, from there you can see the B'chodesh v'Shabbat mechayvin shilach b'li api Rabbi. That on Rosh Chodesh or on Shabbos is when you do greet your Rebbe or this religious figure. So the Gemara says, right, Lokasha, it's not difficult. Had azil v'asi biyome, fine. That's when you're going to come back on the same day. If you're leaving and not coming back and you're literally abandoning your wife for that entire period, so then you're not fulfilling the idea of Simchas Regel. Now it's quite interesting because Rosh Chodesh and Shabbat is not Regel. So the mitzvah of Simchas HaRegel, you could have said, fine, on Rosh Chodesh and Shabbos, then that's when you can. But the point is, even though the story was Rosh Chodesh and Shabbat, Rabbi Yitzchak learned to teach you, and it's interesting how he makes that jump. He learned a verse that's about Rosh Chodesh and Shabbat to say, you see, you have to do it on the Regel. Right? So how does he exactly make that interpretive jump is not clear. But once he's saying that, forget the verse it's based on. If there's a mitzvah to visit your Rebbe on the regel, what do you do with the idea of samach da'atau beitecha? Now, it should be noted, of course, I sort of used the language even before about a pilgrimage, right? That one does wonder, what is this idea of visiting the Rebbe baregel? Like, it could just be, it's a day that you're free from working, so it's a day that you should be focused on pursuing religious pursuits. Okay, but that in a way makes a lot of sense, certainly on Shabbat, right? And that was more regular and so on. The fact that it's interpreted as baregel seems to actually be that this is creating a sort of substitute for the idea of aliyah regel, right? The substitute of going up in the regel. And therefore, rather than going up in the regel and encountering God, and making that pilgrimage to encounter God, it becomes replaced with this pilgrimage to encounter the holy man, to be makbil pnei Rebbe, right? And, so also the words of pnei, like yera'u panai rekam, right? You visit and the presence of God, the face of God. So here from makbil pnei rabo beregel, and that's in sort of in balance with the more domestic reality that we have post the Churban, which is about experiencing it in your household. Now, of course, in the Torah, you do the pilgrimage with your family, and like the whole story. Anyway, so you have like some precedents with that as well. But anyway, with like Chana, right? Chana and her husband come up, and there's anyway. That's the whole story that you do with your family. But in a way, it's interesting to see this as a balance between sort of the domestic reality of the regel nowadays and some type of a substitute of what I would call aliyah l'regel. And according to Rabbi Eliezer, not necessarily everybody agreed with Rabbi Eliezer, but Rabbi Eliezer weighed in favor of the time at home. And the Gemara, fine, you want to go makbil pnei rabo, do it, but come back on the same day. Okay, so the Gemara says like this: Tanu Rabbanan, Ma'aseh Rabbi Eliezer sheshavas bergalil ha'elyon b'sukkato shel Yochanan Rabbi Loi. So there's a story that Rabbi Eliezer spent Shabbat in the Upper Galilee in the sukkah of Yochanan, the son of Rabbi Eli, B'Kaisari in Caesarea. Not clear if it was the same Rabbi Eli before who was his student. Anyway, Amile B'Kaisirion, and some say Caesarion, a different place. Okay, now, of course, the question is, what's he doing in the guy's sukkah? He says you have to be in your sukkah the whole sukkah, right? And even if it wasn't sukkahs, he says you have to be home during the regel. All right, so we're worried about that. Anyway, V'higia Chamal Sukkah, and the sun started shining down on the sukkah, and his host this nice Yochanan Rebbe Loi was afraid that this great Rebbe Eliezer was going to be discomforted by the sun. So Amarlo, he said to him, Ma'usha Efros Aleh Sadin, can I spread a sheet on top of the sukkah to protect you? And the question was here, is it like making an ohel on Shabbat, right? Because you're not allowed to like make a canopy on Shabbat. Amarlo, so he said to him, he avoided answering. He said, you know, it's an interesting thing. There was no one of the 12 tribes of Israel that didn't have a shofet that came from it in the period of the shoftim. So if you look at Rashi, he manages to identify like 9 or 8 out of the 12. Okay, he says the last 4 we can't exactly prove which tribes they were from. But anyway, so he obviously switched the conversation. Now the sun is midway in the sukkah. It's getting really hot in the sukkah. Amarlo. So again, he said to him, can I put a sheet over the sukkah? Amarlo. He said to me, there was not one tribe of the 12 tribes that didn't have prophets that came from it. Okay, Shevet Yehuda and Binyamin, and as far as Yehuda and Binyamin, it might seem they didn't have prophets, but you know what? They had kings that came from Yehuda and Binyamin, right? David and Shaul, and those were anointed, and those were appointed by the Nevi'im. Actually, some of the Mefarshim point out that they actually were Nevi'im from Yehuda. But anyway, so he switched the conversation. So now it got to the legs. You know, Rabbi finally was getting closer and closer, and now was almost directly shining down on Rabbi Eliezer. So Nato Yochanan Tzadin, so he had enough of this. He figured, I'm not going to ask again. My great honored guest is going to be discomforted by the sun. He took this sheet, upiris alao, and he spread it on the sukkah. So Rahivsha Rabbi Eliezer taliso lachorav v'yatza. So Rabbi Eliezer put on his talis, put on his cloak, and he stormed out of the sukkah. He left the sukkah. He was not happy with the fact that this had been done. Now, now the Gemara says not because he was basically trying to push him off with words. It's a funny phrase. He was trying to push him off with words, but it means not because, like in principle, he didn't respect the question, and not because he didn't want to like teach him Torah. It wasn't like he didn't, in a fundamental way, want to answer the question. Ella, but the reason he avoided it was he never said something that he didn't hear from his Rebbe, and therefore, since his Rebbe had never given a ruling about spreading a sheet over a sukkah, whether that's a problem on Shabbos about making a tent or not, he didn't want to give a psak about it. So he didn't want to say yes, he didn't want to say no. He avoided answering the question.
Ironically, he's the guy who never went to visit his Rebbe.
What? Well, I was going to say something about that. Let's hold off on that, okay? So the Gemara says like this: now, how could he have anyway been in the sukkah, or been in this other person's sukkah? You can't be in another sukkah on sukkahs. It says who says it was sukkahs? He was in their nice little hut in the backyard, but it wasn't sukkahs. Sukkah, we didn't mean it in the halachic sense. We mean it in their little porch, their little covered porch. Okay, the Hamar Rebbe Eliezer Mishabeach and Yetatzlam saying Yotim Batein Beregel. So okay, let's let it have been Pesach. Okay, some people have their sukkahs up through Pesach. Anyway, so he said, let it have been Pesach. So you're supposed to be home during the regalim. What was he doing visiting somebody else on a different regel? So the Gemara says, all right, Shabbos Ave. It wasn't a regel, it was Shabbos. Whoever said it was a yontiv, it was Shabbos. He was visiting him. Fine. So the Gemara said. So okay, now back to the issue about can you spread a sheet on the top of a sukkah. So this is the question is in halachic terms whether you can be ose oel arai. Can you make a temporary oel on Shabbos? It's temporary because you don't mean to leave the sheet there. It's only in very temporary, and also there's already a covering over. You're just adding to an existing covering. So that's the question. So the Gemara says, you know what? We can infer it from another position of Rabbi Eliezer. Nan, we taught in the Mishnah, you have a stopper for the window. Okay, so you got a window in your wall, and you would fill it up with a block to fill it and to stop it and to close it off. Now, is that like adding to the wall if you want to put the stopper in on Shabbos? If it's tied to a string and suspended off the ground, then you can stop up the window, because then it's like a part of the wall. It's like almost like it was on hinges, and you're not really doing something new. V'im lav, but if it's not on a string, or even if it is on a string, if it's dragging on the ground, ain't poking bow, you can't stop up the window. That's like you created something new. It's not like it was already, part of and hanging from the wall. Poking bow. And the Rabbi say either way, you can stop it up. It's not considered adding to the wall. So the Gemara says, so look, you see, it would seem that he should have said this was a straight application of not stopping up the window. You wouldn't be able to add a sheet. So the Gemara says, why didn't he just give him a ruling? Presumably that he did hear from his Rebbe. So the Gemara says, no. There, maybe it's only a problem because when you stop up the window, you're going to leave it there for a while. Here, it was much more temporary. It's a sheet that you're going to take off as soon as the sun goes away. It doesn't become not only what your intent is, but structurally, right? Something that fills up a hole in the wall, even if that hole is being used for a window, can really become integrated into the wall, much more than a sheet that's covering the top of a sukkah. So maybe here it would be more lenient. Now, Dov points out the irony that he basically did not like people visiting their Rebbe on the regel, and at the same time, he never said anything he didn't hear from his Rebbe. But as we're about to see, he was like constant by his Rebbeim during the normal, week. So it was really a contrast about sort of investing the time on an ongoing relationship as opposed to generally not having that relationship but making a big deal about it on the Yontif. Seems to have been part also of what this contrast is. So let's take a look at this. Tana Rabbanan, Ma'aseh Rabbi Eliezer, Shavas Begalu La'aya. The story of Rabbi Eliezer, he spent the Shabbat in the upper galley. Maybe it was this exact story, maybe a different one. V'sha'alu shloshim halachot, top of Kaf Chedem Aleph. They asked him 30 halachot b'hilchot Sukkah regarding the laws of Sukkah. So again, it must be that it wasn't exactly Sukkot. Maybe it was Erev Sukkot or something because he had to be home for Sukkot. But okay, they asked him 30 laws about the laws of Sukkah. 12 he said, I have a tradition about this. Here's what I heard. 18 he said, I didn't hear. So actually, the majority he actually didn't hear. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda says it was a little bit different. Chiluf hadvarim, the opposite. 18 he heard. 12 he didn't hear. So at least the majority he was able to answer. Amrlo, they said to him, they say all you are is a tape recorder. Everything you have, you can only tell us things that you heard from your Rebbe. Like, we'd like to hear your own thoughts about this. So Amar Lahem, he said to them, he's kaktuni lomar davar shelo shamati bi rabosai. Are you trying to get me to say something that I didn't hear from my Rebbeim? Miyamai, from all my days, never lo kitmuni adam bebeis hamedrash. You should know that if I don't know something, it's not because I did not have the opportunity to hear it. It's not because I was ever lazy. Again, thinking about the lazy comment before. Miyamai, in all of my days, lo kidmuni adam bebeis hamedrash. Nobody ever beat me to the beis hamedrash. I was always the first guy in the beis medrash. V'lo yashanti bebeis hamedrash lo shinas kever lo shinas harai. Echoing our earlier discussion about taking naps. I didn't sleep in the beis hamedrash. Not a deep sleep. I didn't even take a nap. I was always there and I was always awake. I never left the base medrash with anybody else was there. I was the first to come and the last to leave. I never said a word of batala. I never said a word that wasn't a Torah word. And I never said anything that I didn't hear from my Rebbeim. So the reason of mentioning the first thing, the Marsha, sort of Rashi and the Marsha point out, because is that I will only tell over things I heard by my Rebbeim, but I made 100% sure that anything my Rebbeim had to teach, I totally absorbed, and I was always there and I was always getting it. So if I'm not telling you something, it's not because there was something that I didn't learn. It was because it was not something that my Rebbeim had to teach. Okay, that's all nice, but what still you have though is a conflict of two different approaches to Torah Shabbal Peh. And this actually comes up very powerfully in some of the Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva stories. Rabbi Akiva was the student, and Rabbi Akiva certainly was the classic sort of Torah Shabbal Peh about the sort of creative approach and the using of the human creativity in interpreting the verses and not just being a transmitter and a conduit for what one received. But Rabbi Eliezer's approach to Torah Shabbal Peh was all the approach of Masorah. So if it's all about Masorah, he had to make 1,000% sure that he was getting everything his Rebbeim had to teach, but he would refuse to sort of speculate on his own. It is interesting to see the contrasts, as Dov points out, right? He says before, like, don't visit your Rebbe on the regel, but here he's completely connected to everything his Rebbeim have to teach. But again, I think the point is, don't do something symbolic. Oh, once, 3 times the year I'm going to visit your Rebbe. No, you know what? Visit your Rebbe the entire, spend your time with the Rebbe the entire time. And on the regular, that's when you spend your time at home. But the rest of the time, you should be totally in the base medrash, especially if you're leaving, your home all the rest of the year and you're, early in the morning to late at night in the base medrash. It sort of balances out that he says, at least on Yom Tov, that you should spend at home. For people who maybe are home during the rest of the year, maybe they on Yom Tov go visit their Rebbe. But there's an interesting sort of a mirror image or contrast there. There's also an interesting contrast with I praise the lazy people, right? He exactly was speaking about how he, how he exemplified what it completely is the opposite of, being lazy, of industry and application and always being there, but, able to sort of at least recognize, sometimes it pays to stay at home and not do this. But again, that's on the regular. The rest of the year, you should be, like he would be, always in the base medrash. Okay? So that's the midos of Rabbi Eliezer. Also, one does sort of, it's hard to escape also the parallel of the idea of like the sense of constancy of the base medrash and the constancy of the sukkah. Like you never leave the sukkah. You're in the sukkah 7 days a week, 2 meals a day. You don't go from sukkah to sukkah. You don't go traveling around, right? You plant yourself and you totally make it your home. And, and that sort of, and that attitude toward the sukkah, and you just, you don't look for new ideas and new opportunities and go exploring. Nope, you plant yourself firm and you totally immerse yourself. And sort of how that's paralleled by his experience, like in the base medrash.
Don't go to a hotel if that's something.
Well, that we know, but I'm now making the comparison between his whole approach towards learning and his approach towards life. Okay, so Amru Alav. Now that was about Rabbi Eliezer. Now here's Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was a student of Rabbi Eliezer. Amru Alav Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Miyamav lo sachsi chaschulin. He never spoke a word of not Torah talk. He didn't go 4 amot without learning Torah, without wearing tefillin. Right, the Maharshal points out because tefillin itself is an embodiment of Torah. Nobody ever beat him to the base medrash. Like a lot of this he got from his Rebbe. Talk about getting from your Rebbe. So not only did he get the Torah from the Rebbe, he got the midos, and the ways of behavior and the ways of commitment from the Rebbe. He never slept, not a temporary sleep or a deep sleep. Even though his head was constantly in Torah, when he was in a dirty alleyway, like one that, had like excrement and other types of things, he was able to control his thoughts and not think in Torah as he walked through there. Nobody ever left, he never left at the base of Medrash with anybody left there. He was the last person to leave. Nobody would ever find him with a minute just sitting and like staring off into space and being silent. You never catch him 1 minute. Not only did he not talk Torah talks, he never wasted a minute. He would always be sitting and learning. And nobody opened up the door for his students. He himself, which is quite a fascinating, like didn't exactly fit with the sort of discussions you were expecting, right? This might be that's not really part of the same themes. Like it sounds almost like, the Gemara says a famous story where you find the greatness of God, there you find his humility, right? Pasuk says God is Elohei Elohim Adonai Adonim, and then it says, and he takes care of the orphan and of the poor person and of the widow and so on. So here too, even though he's this amazing Torah giant, he would be the one to open the door for his Talmidim. The Maharshal also says that maybe there was some, competition going on with the students, and he wanted to just get them to cut it out and just get into the base medrash and learn. He also makes the point that there was no guard at the door, like the Hillel story. The guard wouldn't let Hillel in the door. He wanted to make sure that everybody would be able to get into the base medrash. Elohu be'atzmo, he himself. He never said it's something he didn't hear from his Rebbe. He never said he never told other people to leave the base medrash. Right, guys, it's time to go home. Okay, except on Erev Pesach and Erev Yom Kippur, where there because there's a mitzvah you have to prepare your korban Pesach and you have to get ready to eat the seder early so that the kids are awake. And Erev Yom Kippur there's a mitzvah to eat, which is interesting because one was about Rabbi Eliezer who wanted people to be home with their wives on the regel? Did he tell the people to leave also on Erev Sukkot? Did he kick them out on Chol Hamoed Sukkot? Say, get out of the base medrash, go back to be with your wives? Or, maybe not. There's a little bit of a sense about this is like different from what we heard about Rabbi Eliezer, a little different. Rabbi Eliezer Talmido Noheg Achrav. Oh, I'm sorry, I reversed it. I misstated. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, was the Rebbe. Rabbi Eliezer was the student, right? Because Rabbi Eliezer was the Rebbe of Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the door of the Chorban. Right, sorry about that. So anyway, Rabbi Eliezer, his student, followed in a similar practice, and most of the midot we heard from Rabbi Eliezer were those that we heard from the Rebbe, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Okay, Tana Rabbanan, a rabbi's taught. Shmonim Talmidim Hayilo LeHillel HaZaken. Hillel had 80 students. Obviously, not a slight exaggeration here. We'll see. The numbers are very general. 30 were at such a high level that they were at the level of Moshe. They could have had the divine Shechina rest upon them. And 30 of them were fit to have the sun stand for them like it did for Yehoshua. Esrim Beinonim, and there are 20 that were average. So does Beinoni mean lower than the 60, or does Beinoni mean between the Moshe and the Yehoshua range? So I don't know. Anyway, all right. Gadol Shebakulan Yonasan ben Uziel. The greatest was Yonasan ben Uziel, who was the one that did the Targum of, or at least the Targum is ascribed to him. The Targum we have is ascribed to him, but anyway, he did the Targum on Nevim and Ksuvim. Koten Shebakulam, the smallest of them was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So all the thing we heard about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he was at the bottom of all the students of Hillel.
All students of the Beinoni.
It sounds like Yonasan ben Uziel was the very top of the 80, and Yochanan ben Zakkai was the very bottom. That's how I understand it. Now they said about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Shelo iniach mikra, Mishnah, Gemara, Halachos, Ve'agados, Tiktukei Torah, Tiktukei Sofrim. He did not abandon, like he spent his time mastering everything, whether it was Mishnah, whether it was Gemara. Now, of course, the irony is Gemara, here he's a Tana, right? He's a student of Hillel. So Rashi says, even for the Tanaim, when the analysis they did of the earlier statements of the earlier Tanaim is called Gemara. Any analysis of the earlier stuff that's handed down is called Gemara. Okay, halachos, agados, diktukei Torah, like learning things out from letters in the Torah, diktukei so from rabbinic institutions, kalim v'chamurim, gzeres shavos, ways of inferring things from verses, kavachomer, gzeres shava, tkufos, gematrios, sort of figuring out astronomical issues, doing sort of numerology, sichas malachi ashares, unknowing the speech of the heavenly angels, v'sichas shadim, the speech of the demons, v'sichas tekalim, knowing how the palm trees talk, like inferring things from the swaying of the palm trees, mishalos kovasim, mishalos shoalim, parables of launderers, parables of foxes. You tell a story with a fox or with a launderer. Davar gadol v'davar katan, big things and small things. What's big and small? Davar gadol ma'aseh merkava. Big is like the hugest things, right? The workings of the divine chariot. Davar katan, small, is havayis to by Rabbi. The types of questions Abai Rabbi asks, meaning all the learning that we do of Shas. That's small, okay? As opposed to the huge theological issues relative to those, that's small. Okay, this fulfills the verse, to give to bequeath to those who love me, yesh, something of substance. So to him, amalei, their storehouses I will fill. So filled with all the knowledge of Torah that comes through a love of God and a love of Torah. So the Gemara says, if the smallest one was at the level of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, how much more so was the greatest one, Yonasan ben Uziel, exponentially higher. Yonasan ben Uziel, they said about Yonasan ben Uziel, when he was learning Torah, any bird flying over him would be burnt, because the fiery angels would be flying over Yonasan ben Uziel to participate in the Torah. If you look at Tosfos, he says, like when he was learning it, like remember it says that the greatest ones were like Moshe Rabbeinu. It was like getting the Torah all again at Har Sinai, so all the fire of Har Sinai was surrounding him. So very obviously, tremendous imagery about the power of that learning. Now, it is interesting. I do want to say something about this, because it's listing all of the things that Yonasan ben Uziel, right? I mentioned this idea about these two paradigms of Torah Shabbal Peh. Is it Masorah, which is clearly what Rabbi Eliezer is, or is it Yonasan, or is it what I call Rabbi Akiva, which is much more the human creativity? Now it's worth noting that although the Gemara says that that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai never said anything he didn't hear from his rebbes, notice the things it said that he mastered, right? What did he master? He mastered Gemara. He mastered Kal V'chomer. He mastered Gzeira Shava. He mastered Havayos Dabai V'Rava. All of those are not just facts to pass down. All of those are analytic. Right? When the discussions of Abai V'Rava, the hypothetical questions that they raise, or learning something out from a Kal V'chomer, that's about using your mind and deriving something. It's not just about Masorah. Gemara is about analyzing something. So are we supposed to understand that? No, he didn't himself engage in this. He just said over what his Rebbeim said about all this, but he himself didn't actually participate in this endeavor. Is that what we're supposed to believe? Or are we supposed to say that, no, it's not so black and white? Rabbi Eliezer, notice that Rabbi Eliezer's midos that he learned from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai were a subset of them, right? The Gemara only says a smaller piece of what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, of Rabbi Eliezer, than what it says about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So it could be that what Rabbi Eliezer did was what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai did, but Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai did was not what Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai might have had a broader understanding. It's like now things that are going on, or have been going on for the last, 20, 30 years about the Rav. Different students of the Rav have a very different understanding of what he was and what his teaching was, and and whether he was modern or was he a traditionalist or was he this or was he that. And the point is that you have somebody who's really great, is very complex and multifaceted, and different students take one piece of that and not the whole part of that. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, it sounds like, was not just straight conduit. I just pass down what I get. He's involving himself in Gemara, in Havayas Dabai V'Rava, in Kal V'chomer. He also is very careful to pass down exactly what he sees from his Rabosa. What Rabbi Eliezer gets from that is just the Masorah part, right? That's the piece that Rabbi Eliezer gets from. He sort of isn't go-race the rest of it. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai actually seems to represent something that's much broader than just pure Masorah. And let's not forget, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was a student of Hillel. The whole chiddush of Hillel was that people didn't know, if you remember how Hillel became to be the Nasi, they didn't know, can you bring a Pesach on Erev Pesach Shechali up Shabbos? And he came and he proved it to them 30 different ways from different interpretations of the verses, and they didn't want to hear it. B'nai B'tzera didn't want to hear it. Then finally he said, I have a Masorah from Shammai Vavkalim. He said, Masorah, why didn't you say so in the first place? So, and then they accepted it. So the whole point about Hillel was trying to show that there's a different way of doing Torah than just Masorah. But there was a lot of resistance to that. So Yochanan ben Zakkai, his student, really, I think what we're hearing, really had all aspects of it. And Rabbi Eliezer, the student of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, just focused in on the one piece of it. That, I think, is somewhat of the message of what's going on here. Yes?
Ironically, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai probably instituted more innovations.
Thank you. I meant to mention that too. Think for a minute. Yochanan ben Zakkai, besides all his takanot, he was the one that was forward-looking enough to deal with the impending Korban Habayis and to realize that we have to reshift the emphasis to Torah and to Yavneh, and was willing to go out and really to make the deal with the Romans, right? So it was like, you cannot say, Rabbi was like, he was just Masorah, right? But in Rabbi Eliezer's eyes, that's all it was just Masorah. But actually, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was a much broader and more complex character. Okay, so
From Eretz Israel, clearly, right?
yes.
But Hillel came from Bavel.
He had went to Bavel after he learned with Shmai Vavkalim. Yeah, he had. I don't exactly.
We identify Hillel as a Bavli.
Yeah, the Gemara says Achaba Hillel HaBavli. Yeah.
Very interesting thing.
Yeah, I know. I don't know when he learned. Yeah, I don't know when he initially learned and when he traveled. Yeah.
Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai would have had to have been a young man when he was learning with Hillel, because they were several generations apart.
That's a good point. Hillel died when? About.
Hillel was from, I thought, the first century, the last century before the Common Era, right? Before the turn of the Common Era.
Right. Now, I know Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai was very old at this time of the Korban, but that would have had to have been.
It spanned the century.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't know.
So I'm wondering whether he said when he said Katan, that might have been that he was also the youngest.
Right. It's a good point. It's Katan as the youngest. It's a good
Yeah.
point. Anyway, by the way, the issue about Havayis Dabai Virova being a Davar Katan is fascinating. I mean, that's important in the Rambam's whole approach, because the Rambam actually thinks that the whole point of learning Gemara is that you know the halacha, but then you're able to free up your time to like study philosophy and theology. And he sort of bases it a little bit on this like Gemara that Davar Gadol is Maaseh Merkava. That's the real goal. Davar Katan is Havayis Dabai Virova. But at the same time, the Rambam understands that most people can't deal with Maaseh Merkava, which for the Rambam was like philosophy and theology. So everybody has access to Havayis Dabai Virova, to the type of learning of Gemara. Yes.
There was discussion about this difference in approach between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva.
Yes. And the Agaritas of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, I've spoken about that before when we did in the Daf Yomi, like, I don't know, a year ago, whatever. But I can point you to, I wrote some of it up. But yes, there in some of those Agaritas, you really see how, because Rabbi Akiva, more than Hillel, Hillel sort of shows that's his innovation. But Rabbi Akiva totally was the embodiment of the sort of creative approach towards Talmud Torah. And in some of those encounters about Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer on the deathbed of Rabbi Eliezer, you really sort of see that contrast. Okay, let's take a look now at the Mishnah. Somebody who, we had this Mishnah quoted before, so we're not going to actually analyze the first half because we analyzed it before. We're going to focus on the second half. Somebody whose head and the majority of his body was in the sukkah and the table was in the house. Beit Shammai posting Beit Hillel machshirin. Beit Shammai invalidates and Beit Hillel says it's kosher. Because they're afraid, again, assuming it's a big sukkah, it's not a question of minimum size, they're afraid that you'll be drawn after where your table is. So Beit Hillel said to Beit Shammai, again, here we have another story. Wasn't this a story? That the elders of Beit Shammai went to visit Rabbi Yochanan ben Achuranit, and he was there, his head and body was in the sukkah, and his table was inside the house. And they didn't say anything to him. So you see that it's okay, or else they would have said something to him. Beit Shammai said back to Beit Hillel, Misham, right? You want to bring a proof from there? No, they did say something to him. They said, if this is what you've been doing your whole life, then you've never fulfilled the mitzvah of sukkah. Very lovely thing to be saying. Anyway, it's fascinating. Like Beit Hillel, where was Beit Hillel when that was being said? I don't know. They went to use the bathroom or something, and that's when Beit Shammai said it. So there's different versions about what happened. Okay, moving on. We're not going to analyze that. We analyzed that before. Women, slaves, and children are exempt. It's a classic positive time-bound mitzvah that only adult males are obligated in. A minor who doesn't need his mother, chayev b'sukkah, has to be in a sukkah. Who's somewhat independent, has to be in a sukkah. We'll see in the Gemara that that's not biblical. That is rabbinic. That's the mitzvah of chinuch, of educating children in the mitzvah. Masa story, V'yalda kalasu Shammai hazaken, Shammai's daughter-in-law gave birth, upiches hamaziva, and he made a hole in the plaster above the ceiling, v'sichach al gabe amita, and put some schach directly over the cradle, bishvil katan, for the minor. Okay, which is a little crazy, right? Because, who needs to do chinuch for a one-day-old infant? But he used a dofen akuma, he used the idea of the bending wall with the ceiling, and he got a little schach in the middle, and therefore even the minor was eating in a sukkah. All right, let's take a look at the Gemara. Minani mili, where does this come from, this exemption of women, slaves, and minors? The Tanu Avanan, we taught, Ezrach, a citizen, all Ezrach B'Yisrael Yesh B'Sukkah, all citizens dwell in Sukkah. Ezrach, Ze Ezrach, that's a normal citizen. Ha-Ezrach, which means anyone, men and women. Ha-Ezrach, the hey, Lahotzias Anashim is an extra letter, and it's coming to say, no, only men, not women. Kol, but then it says Kol, L'Rabos as a Ketanim. That's coming to include the minors, because we see in the Mishnah some minors are obligated. So this is very bizarre. So let's take a look. Amamar, Hezrach lahotzias anashim. The hey is coming to exclude women. Lememra, this suggests the Ezrach, the word Ezrach by itself, bein nashim ben gavri mashpa, would suggest men and women, and it's only the extra hey that excludes women. The Hatanya, but we taught in the Brisa, Ha-Ezrach, the Ezrach, L'Rabos es hanashim hezrachiyot shechayavos b'inoi. This is the pasuk about fasting on Yom Kippur. It says, Hiko hanefesh shir lo tu nebetz hamayom. What is it? What's the pasuk? It's Rashi quotes the pasuk. Hold on. Tanuas nafsho sechem b'chol melacha lo ta'asu ha'ezrach v'ager hagar b'tochachem. So you should fast and not do melacha. The ezrach. So ha-ezrach, same word, ha-ezrach, says the Braita, is including women, that women are also obligated to fast. So Alma, you see, Ezrach Gavri Mashma, that Ezrach by itself means men, and the Hema means to include women. So which is it? Is ha-ezrach including women or excluding women? So Amar Rabba Hilchas Saninu. You know what? You're right. It isn't really, the verses aren't really teaching it. It's really just a halacha l'Moshe Misinai, or a tradition. Ras Michinu Rabbanan Akrai, and the rabbis linked it to a verse. All right, so fine. Yeah, we're not being consistent. We just have it by tradition. So the Gemara doesn't want to say that it's all by tradition. One of the things has to be implied by the verse. So what do you get from the verse, and what does the halacha come to modify? What would be the simple sense of the verse? Number one. For two, but anyway, Kra Lamali, Hilchas Lamali. Who needs a pasuk? Who needs a halacha l'Moshe Misinai? All of this should have been just self-evident. The halacha by sukkah and the halacha by fasting. Sukkah, ha-mitzukah, mitzvah seisha zman grama. Sukkah is a positive time-bound mitzvah. V'chol mitzvah seisha zman grama nashim p'turos. And women are exempt, so it just is an application of a general principle. Who needs a pasuk? Who needs a halacha l'Moshe Misinai? It's just a general principle. Of course women are exempt. That's for sukkah. And when you get to Yom Kippur, Yom Kippurim, Rav Yudah Marav dafka, you could learn it out from Rav Yudah Marav. Amar Rav Yudah Marav, v'chein tanu the Rav Yishmael. Amar Krav, the verse says, Ish o Isha, man or woman, who will do any of the sins. So from that we learn, Hisha kaziv Isha li'ish l'chol anashim shebetorah, that men and women, when it comes to something that is a sin and a punishment, as opposed to a positive mitzvos, men and women are categorized equally. There's not a distinction. And since Yom Kippur, although the verse only talks about a positive mitzvah of te'anu, the Gemara learns out that it's also a negative prohibition, and it learns out that there's a punishment of kares. So anything that there's a punishment with, men and women are equally bound by. So you know Sukkah, they're exempt, the general principle mitzvah sasei shazman grama. You know Yom Kippur, they're chayav, the general principle of a negative prohibition with a punishment, women are chayav. So why do you need anything? So Amar Bayi la'olam Sukkah hilchasa. Sukkah is the halacha. The general understanding is ha'ezrach comes to include women. But there's a chiddush by Sukkah, a halacha to tell you to exclude women. Now, why do you need a halacha to tell you to exclude? Why would I have thought otherwise? The itztrich, you need a halacha. I would have thought to say teshvu. It says you shall dwell in a sukkah, which we've interpreted to mean ke'ein taduru. You dwell in a sukkah like you dwell in your house. Madira ish v'ishto. The same way when you're in a house, it's man and women, husband and wife living together. Af sukkah ish v'ishto. So a sukkah, in order to be like your house, husband and wife have to continue living together. So for it to be a house, it would have to obligate women, which is a pretty reasonable idea. Kamash Milan. So that's why you needed a special halacha l'Moshe Misinai to tell you, though, even though logically maybe women should be obligated because to make it like a normal type of living in the house, no, they're not obligated, and it goes back to the general rule that a positive time-bound mitzvah, women are exempt. Rava Amar, so that's why you needed the halacha. Rava says itzrich. Here's another reason you needed the special chiddush to exempt women by sukkah. I would have thought yalif chamisha sar chamisha samichag matzos. Remember, we introduced this idea yesterday that you're obligated to eat the first night in sukkah because you learn it out from Pesach, from the fact that it says 15 in both places. So the same way women are obligated on matzah the first night because it's linked to the prohibition of chametz. Afkan nashim chayavos. So let me say, it would have been a very reasonable thing to say. At least for the first night, let women be obligated. If we're learning out the first night of Sukkah, so on the first night of Pesach, that's a very reasonable thing to have said. Kamash Milan, that no, women are exempt. So even though it would be more like a house, and even though it would be more comparable to the way we learn it out from Pesach to say women are obligated, nevertheless, the halacha tells me, halacha l'Moshe Misinai, that women are exempt. Okay. The hashta damarta sukkah hilchasa. Now that sukkah is halacha l'Moshe Misinai, kra lamali. So what's the point of the verse to say ha'ezrach b'Yisrael yeshvu basukot? If the word ha'ezrach is we're saying means to be more inclusive, but it's not being inclusive of women, what is it being inclusive of? So the Gemara says, "L'rabos hasagerim," to be inclusive of converts. I would have thought ha'ezrach b'Yisrael amarachmana, the Ezrach in Yisrael, which maybe means naturally born Jew. V'lo hasagerim kamash malan. So the word ha'ezrach is inclusive to say, obviously, it includes converts as well. Interesting. Tosfos discusses, like, when do you need a pasuk to include converts? Aren't we always assuming that converts are, kager, ka'ezrach, and so on? But sometimes the Gemara does need it, sometimes it doesn't, and and Tosfos deals with some of those issues. Okay, but that's what you get by Sukkah. Ha'ezrach is inclusive. You don't need it to include women. Women are excluded, and and even though there's a logic to include women, they're still excluded.
I assume it's male.
Yeah. Yes. Yom Kippurim. Now, how about Yom Kippur? Why do you need a pasuk to include women by Yom Kippur? You learn it out from the fact that women are obviously obligated to fast because it's something that is a prohibition. You only need it to tell you that they're not only obligated to fast on Yom Kippur, they're obligated in the extra period of fasting, right? Because you begin fasting a little bit before the day begins. I would have thought, since the Torah excludes this extra period of fasting from punishment and from the negative prohibition, yes, you're obligated to add a few extra minutes before the day begins, but it's not a negative prohibition and it's not punishable by kares. So therefore, it's not the normal types of things that would bind women. So maybe women aren't obligated to do the extra adding. Kamash Malan, that they are. Since they're obligated to do the primary fasting, they're also obligated to add to the fasting and to start a few minutes before. Two interesting questions about that. The Rishash says, why doesn't it also say that women are obligated to do the Tosefes Malacha, to begin not doing Malacha a few minutes before sunset? Since the pasuk of Ha'ezrach also relates to anybody who doesn't fast and doesn't do Malacha, right? So, and he says this might be a basis for the Rambam, that the Rambam says that the only biblical mitzvah of Tosefet is not on Shabbos, not on Yom Tov, only on Yom Kippur, and even on Yom Kippur, only about the fasting and not about the Malacha. So he does point out the fact that the Gemara only mentioned the issue of Tosefes Inui and not the Tosefes of the Isser Malacha, that also we add a few minutes and we stop before sunset. Other interesting debate in the poskim is, are women obligated in the mitzvah of eating on Erev Yom Kippur? Right? So that's like, is that positive or is that connected to the fasting the same way they're supposed to fast and they're supposed to add the extra time of fasting? Or they also have this mitzvah of eating Erev Yom Kippur or not, is an interesting debate of the Achron. Anyway, that's what we get. Women are exempt from Sukkah even though there would have been an logic to obligate them, and they're obligated in fasting on Yom Kippur not only in the primary but even on the Tosefes. Let's get to the Mishnah. Amar Mar. All the Rabbi says to include minors. How can you say minors are obligated? Women, slaves, and minors are exempt. It's whether he's of the age of instruction or not. Doing chinuch, of training him to prepare to be able to do the mitzvah. So the Gemara says, okay, but chinuch is only a rabbinic idea. How are you learning it out from the verse? Kol, to include minors. All right, midrabanan, it's rabbinic. V'kras machta b'alma. The verse is just a biblical leaning, but it really is rabbinic. Okay, now, once the minor doesn't need his mother, that's when the obligation of chinuch begins. What means he's independent from his mother? When he goes to the bathroom and he doesn't need for his mother to wipe up after him. All right, what is that, like 2, 3? Rabbi, I don't know, depends on the kid, I guess. Anybody who gets up in the middle of the night and doesn't say, Mommy. So the Gemara says, Ima, Mommy, Gedolim Nami Karu, even bigger kids. I hope it doesn't mean 30-year-olds, maybe, it depends. But okay, even when you're clearly, an older kid, you sometimes wake up and call for your mother. Ella, so here's what you should say. Koshaner mi v'eno kore ima ima. A kid who wakes up and then say, Mommy, 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 until the mother comes. Once you're beyond that stage, then you're independent. Now, I do want to say something. This is the age of chinuch. Now, in general, chinuch, Tosfos points out, is not a strict age, 4, 5, 6. It's relative to the mitzvah. Are you able to do the mitzvah can you do the act of the mitzvah? So, for example, can you shake a lulav? Then chinuch begins for lulav. Can you wear tzitzit without sort of getting them, dirty or whatever? Then you do the mitzvah of tzitzit. So this issue, can you walk by yourself? Then there's like chinuch of aliyah l'regel. All right, so here the fact that it describes what does it mean to live in a sukkah, when are you considered able to do it, is when you have a degree of independence, right, underscores a point that I've been trying to say, which is the idea of living in a sukkah does not just mean physically being there. It means to some degree being empowered and being in control and being independent. If you're a kid and you need your mommy, you're not really the one who's living in a sukkah. The same way a sick person or a mitzdaer, you might be physically present, but you see the sort of analogy I'm making, right? If you're laid up in bed because you're sick or you're a kid, you can physically be in the sukkah and sleep and eat, but that's not what it means to live in a place. So I think it's important that the definition here of being able to do the act is having a certain degree of independence. Let's just do the last case. Masa Biyalda Kalaso, the Shammai's daughter-in-law. Masa Listor? How is this? It's contradicting, because obviously this is an infant. This isn't the age of chinuch. So the man says, fine, it's missing some words. Here's the sense of it. V'shamai machmir. Shammai would go overboard, even younger than the age of chinuch. Umaysanami, there was a story of Yalda Kalaso Shel Shammai Hazakein Upiches Amaziva V'sicha Chalamita B'Shvila Katan, and he even did it for a one-day-old infant. But that was a little overboard. But certainly, when they're at the age of chinuch, that's when the mitzvah begins. Okay.